It's really wonderful to be back, but I am afraid I'm not bringing great news, just to manage people's expectations as we start. So for those of you who this is your first time here, I'll just give you a little bit of background on the Reykjavik Index. And as Sandra said, we set this up for the inaugural meeting of the Reykjavik Global Forum in 2018. So I'm sharing today the 6th data point in an annual international data research program. And what the Reykjavik Index for Leadership does, it measures how women and men are perceived in terms of their suitability for leadership. So it's an index, not a percentage. 3 things to remember about it. It isn't about outcomes, it's about inputs. It's about how people in society frame their thinking about men and women as leaders. It captures prejudice against men as well as women. So if there are sectors where men are prejudiced against, and we have found some, not many, to be honest, but we have found a couple, then it will pick that up. And the other thing is we look at more than 20 different economic sectors to get to this. So overall, we provide a score of 0 to 100. And all that a score of 100 means is the absence of prejudice. And so in many of the countries where we do this research, gender prejudice is illegal in the workplace in all kinds of ways. But what this is saying is it might be the legislative and regulative environment or context might be there, but in people's minds, we're not equal. So if I was to say a country had a Reykjavik Index score of 70, what that would mean is if you took a male and a female leader, a metaphor would be they're on a 100-kilometer race, and at the 71st kilometer, the woman just hits a wall. That's just a metaphor for how this works, and the men would keep going. So a score of less than 100 is simply a measure of prejudice. So we'll take it from there. So I'm going to share the data for 23-24. The research was done during August, September, and October, and I'm going to share it, first of all, for the G7. So the way we've done this is every year we've looked at the G7, but also brought in different regions. And this year, thank you very much to the Icelandic government, we've been able to do this research now across the Nordics. So just a little bit more context before I share the data. In the last 10 years, working in the world of researching and explaining social trends, we have hit a new period in terms of a period where for the first time we see counter trends that we haven't seen in the last 70 years. And so if we think about what is behind this, we've had economic recession following the 2008 crisis, deindustrialization, creating the conditions for populism, and social media, meaning that people can stay in their bubbles. And the reason I say this is that our data, I have found, is quite confronting to liberal policymakers. Because our bubbles, something different is happening to what is happening in across society. So last year what happened is I think people immediately found the data unsettling or troubling, and then about a month after Reykjavik, Andrew Tate, one of those great British exports, was arrested, and I think the context behind the data became more obvious. Right, I will move on. So last year, for the first time, we were able to provide a 5-year data series, and what we showed was that nothing was improving. So what I'll do now is show you where we are on year 6. This is the overall Reykjavik Index for the G7 group of countries. First time we did the work, it was 72. Last year, after 5 years, it was 72, and we've just got it now at 70. So this is not stasis, this is some sense of reversal. And there's a lot of data on here, so I'm just going to ask you to look at Canada, UK, and USA. So for those of you who have been sort of aware of the Reykjavik Index for the last 5 or 6 years, you know that when we originally did this research for the G7, the top performing countries were Canada, the UK, and the USA. And if you look at what is going on, that is over 6 years, a curve down in those countries. And the most shocking thing is what is driving it. And what is driving it is a historical anomaly. For the first time since the 1950s, young people coming through with more regressive attitudes than their parents, which is really something that is moving fast and is something we haven't seen before. So if you look at the data on the left-hand side, the teal, the blue line, is the line of the Reykjavik Index polled over 6 years for young people. People under the age of 35, look how quickly it's dropped in the last year. And if you look at, the UK data is very concerning, the US data is very concerning, but this is happening across the G7 with the exception of Italy. So our young people carry more prejudice against female leaders than their parents. Now this trend is being led by men, by young men, but the really important thing is that young women are also part of this trend. So again, a lot of data, because it's important to see how it varies. It is only in Italy that young women are more progressive than the older generation in the G7. So on the left-hand side, you can see the difference between young women and older women. And on the right-hand side, you can see the difference between young men and older men. Again, look at the UK, 19-point drop in the Reykjavik Index between the youngest and the oldest, who we've done the research with. But you can also see, a 20-point drop for women, which is completely staggering. And standing there as a British woman, I simply cannot believe where this could have happened. But the countries where this is happening fastest are those who have had the experience of deep populist politics. And when we first started doing this work, we were 18 months off from Brexit and from the election of Donald Trump. We knew these events had happened, but we hadn't seen the impact. Okay, let's end with some good news. First look at the Nordics. And so this is the first time we've been able to look at the Nordic region as a group. And actually, as you just heard from Katrin in the previous session, the Nordics are holding up very well, but we don't yet have time series. So what we know is that this is a point in time. Their scores are much higher. They are still, though, demonstrating pretty significant prejudice. And if you look at Denmark and Finland at 83 and 82, that's where the UK was a few years ago. So what we shouldn't do is think that we're in a safe position, but what we can see is that things are happening in the Nordics that make them more resilient to these forces of change. And we have a session on that tomorrow. But there is some great news there. And we also did the research in the Netherlands for the first time. And that is also a heartening result. So in summary, we're in an era of social polarization and fragmentation in many countries in the world. Overall, in the G7, at best, we're in a time of stasis, but with regard to the perceptions of women and their right to lead, we are moving to a reversal. The drivers of this come from a coalition of forces. Something as significant as this never comes because of one thing. So it comes from economic inequality, bad actors targeting our young people on social media, populist politics, and also, I think, a reaction to the evolution of the corporate workplace. There's something going on with young men that is coming from a place of fear. And there is no silver bullet in public policy. We need to work against this reversal on all fronts.